used to tell people I loved teaching. It wasn't true, not really. It just sounded better than admitting the job kept me occupied. Most of the staff assumed I had everything figured out. They didn't see me lingering after hours, shuffling papers like I was grading, so I wouldn't have to go back to a flat that felt more like a cell than a home. People believe what makes them comfortable. I never stopped them. That Monday began like any other. Rain threaded down the classroom windows, a steady drizzle that dulled the whole building into a kind of sleep. The students came in with their usual mix of muttering and lazy chatter, jackets dripping, trainers squeaking over the laminate. I didn't have the energy for anything ambitious, so I started with a warm-up. Draw a character you'd like to write about this term. Anyone, from a story, from your imagination. 10 minutes. Pencils rasped. A few argued over colored pencils. One boy tried to fit a dragon the size of a bus onto a single page. Ordinary noise, almost comforting. Then I looked toward the back row. Joel Watkins sat hunched over his desk, shoulders pulled tight, tongue caught between his teeth as he concentrated. He was the sort of quiet kid who apologized for breathing too loudly. I expected something harmless from him, a pet, a cartoon hero. When he slid his paper forward shyly, the air left my lungs. The face he'd drawn wasn't fantasy. It was familiar in a way that turned my blood cold. Wide brown eyes, hair falling unevenly across the forehead, a small dark mark on the right cheekbone, a mole Caleb spent years trying to hide in photos. Caleb, my younger brother. We fought the way brothers do, and I always told myself I'd look out for him. That night in the woods had been another argument that went too far, another moment I replayed until it dulled at the edges. And then he was gone. 20 years since I'd seen his face, and there it was in pencil on loose-leaf paper, drawn by a boy who hadn't even been alive when Caleb disappeared. I forced my voice steady. Interesting. Who's this supposed to be? Joel hesitated, pencil hovering. Then he wrote a title above the head in small, careful block letters. The Boy in the Leaves. Something crawled up my spine. Where did you get the idea? I asked. He looked up, open and earnest, like the answer should have been obvious. He told me to draw him, he said, so you'd see. The rain sounded louder after that. The room felt colder. And the years I'd spent packing Caleb away inside me shifted, as if something buried underneath had started to move. I spent the rest of the day trying to explain it away. Kids drew odd things. They copied each other. They picked up details from conversations they weren't meant to hear. Coincidence was safer than touching anything else. By morning, I'd built a tidy wall around it. One drawing wasn't an omen. It was just a drawing. Then they handed in their free writes. During silent reading, I flipped through the stack and stopped at a short piece from a girl who usually wrote about princesses and ponies. This time she wrote about a boy who stood under the trees, smiling a lopsided smile that revealed a chipped front tooth. Caleb's chipped tooth from falling off his bike when he was 7. My throat tightened. I set it aside and grabbed the next. Another story, another boy. He laughed, the student wrote, like he couldn't quite catch his breath. Caleb wheezed when he laughed hard enough. A third described a boy who walked like he had a stone in his shoe. Caleb's right leg was slightly shorter than the other, something only our family ever noticed. My pulse climbed, but the first thing that hit wasn't fear. It was irritation, hot and sharp. Someone had to be behind this. Older kids stirring something cruel. A sibling at home feeding them details. Children were careless. Sometimes adults were worse. Under that anger sat shame, familiar and rancid, whispering that I was ridiculous for letting this matter, that I was overreacting, that it shouldn't touch me anymore. When silent reading ended, I closed the stack and kept my tone light. These stories, quite a few of you chose the same character this week. Did you plan that? Talk about it beforehand. They shook their heads. A few looked genuinely confused. No one told us to, a girl said. We just saw him, another added. Saw him, I repeated, trying to sound casual while my chest tightened. In our dreams, someone said. It was the same boy, a third chimed in, as if clarifying something obvious. I swallowed. Okay, but why him? Why that face? Silence pooled. Then one boy, small, nervous, always chewing the sleeves of his jumper, half raised his hand and lowered it again. I coaxed him gently. His voice trembled. He said he used to be your brother, he whispered. But he's different now. He stared at the floor. He wants you to find him. The room felt like it stopped breathing. I forced a tight smile, mumbled something about imagination and recurring themes, and sent them out for break. But my mind was already sliding into motion, gears catching after years of rust. This couldn't keep happening. If someone was spreading stories about my family, I needed to know who. If someone was manipulating these kids, it had to end before it became a rumor mill. I told myself I'd investigate quietly, ask around, check for older siblings, trace where the boy in the leaves started. Deep down, something colder whispered I was already too late. I didn't want to go to my mother's house. I never did. Being there meant brushing against memories I'd spent years sanding down into something bearable. But after the drawings, after the talk of dreams, I couldn't argue myself out of it. The drive was only 20 minutes, yet every mile dragged. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered, unless I'd simply outgrown it while she stayed trapped in grief. She opened the door before I knocked. She always did, like she spent her days listening for footsteps that never arrived. Evan, she said, smiling tightly, eyes unchanged. The lines in her face had deepened. Grief had settled into her features like bone. We traded stiff pleasantries, circling what I'd really come for. When conversation ran out, as it always did, she led me down the hall. Caleb's room was preserved exactly as she'd kept it since the week he vanished. Posters bleached by sun, trophies untouched, bedding smoothed as if he might slip under it at any moment. I stood in the doorway, half expecting some sign that whatever had reached into my classroom had reached here too. But nothing had changed. It should have comforted me. Instead, it twisted into a knot of disappointment. If something had been disturbed, at least I'd have proof I wasn't losing my mind. Oh, something came, my mother said suddenly. She went to her dresser, pulled an envelope from a drawer, and handed it to me. No return address. Just this. Inside was a crayon drawing, rough and uneven. Caleb stood in our old backyard, smiling, same bright eyes, same uneven hair, same slight head tilt like he was listening. My throat tightened. You sent this, didn't you? My mother asked softly. Some sort of apology. No, I whispered, unable to look away. The timeline clicked. A week ago, exactly when the kids said the dreams began. But something else snagged my attention. I stared at the yard behind Caleb, the clothesline, the fence, the sloping hill. Then it hit me. The hill was wrong. In the drawing, the ground behind him dipped sharply into a steep drop. Our backyard never had that. Not like that. It looked like the embankment in the woods, the one from the night he vanished, the one I'd spent 20 years remembering as gentle, harmless, forgettable. In crayon, it was what it had really been. A sudden fall, steep enough to hurt a child. My stomach turned. Evan, my mum asked. What is it? I folded the drawing before she could read my face. Whoever drew this wasn't remembering the past. They were remembering my past, the real one I'd never said out loud. They knew the place I'd pretended didn't exist. By the next morning, the last scraps of professionalism I'd been clinging to had frayed. I wasn't thinking like a teacher, or even like an adult. I just needed answers, and the only people who seemed to have them were 12-year-olds who should have been worrying about lunch queues, not the last night my brother was alive. I called Joel in first. He shuffled into the empty classroom, smaller than usual, as if he knew he didn't belong in this conversation. I shut the door. Joel, I said evenly, tell me where you heard about that boy, the one you drew. He stared at his shoes. His hands were tucked into his sleeves, knuckles pale through fabric. I didn't hear it, he said. He showed me. My jaw tightened. Showed you in a dream. He nodded barely. Joel, it's important you're honest. If another student told you about the boy, he flinched before I finished. He doesn't like when you ask about him, Joel whispered. He wants you to remember on your own. Cold swept through me, quick as a blade. Remember what? Joel shook his head fast. He told me not to say that part. Joel. My voice snapped sharper than I meant. He recoiled, and and I forced myself to soften. What did he mean? His eyes glassed with fear. He glanced past me, like he was checking the corners. He said, his voice thinned to almost nothing. He said you were there the night he changed. My stomach hollowed. No one knew I'd been with Caleb that night. I'd spent years reciting the polished version. I hadn't seen him after dinner. We de-argued the day before. I'd said goodnight. A clean lie. A safe one. I had never told anyone I was the last person to see him breathing. How do you know that? I breathed. Joel squeezed his eyes shut, like repeating it was already a punishment. Because he told me he remembers you. He remembers what you did. But he says you remember it wrong. My pulse slammed in my ears. Something was feeding these children details pulled straight from the locked rooms of my mind. Did he say anything else? I managed. Joel nodded, trembling now. He said he's coming to school today. He wants to watch you teach. The words smoked in the air between us. I dismissed him quickly, but I couldn't focus. Every time I looked up, my gaze dragged toward the windows. By midday, curiosity curdled into dread. I got up and went to the glass. Outside, beyond the football pitch, where the school grounds met the first line of trees, a figure stood small and still, facing the building. Facing me. Distance and glare hid the details, but certainty punched through logic, bone deep. It was him. Caleb. I didn't know how. I only knew he was back. By lunchtime, the figure was gone. I stood at the edge of the pitch, staring into the woods, half convinced I'd hallucinated it. Teachers wandered by, oblivious. Kids shouted and laughed and kicked balls across wet grass. Everything was painfully normal. But the trees looked expectant, leaning in, listening. I told myself I was exhausted, that I was being ridiculous, and still my feet carried me toward the tree line. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. Voices faded, wind flattened. Even the branches seemed to hush, replaced by a subtle, spiraling shift of leaves on the forest floor, as if something had just stepped back into cover. My throat tightened. I knew this feeling. Not this exact spot, but the presence of it. The sense the trees were watching, holding their breath. In my memories, the forest where Caleb and I had our last argument was smaller, thinner, less oppressive, but memory smooths what it needs to hide. A flash of that night returned, sharp enough to sting. Caleb's face red with frustration, his hands thrown up as he said he was sick of me bossing him around, me turning away. Fueled by resentment, I never admitted. His footsteps behind me, my anger drowning out the idea of turning back. And then years of nothing, just empty air where he should have been. I'd clung to the comforting lie. Caleb ran away. Someone took him. Anything but the simplest truth. I left him. I stepped under the trees. Leaves cushioned the ground, sloping toward a shallow dip. At first it seemed natural, like a hollow made by weather or a fallen log. But the shape was wrong. A depression the size of a child curled on their side, fresh, undisturbed. Something had been here recently, or still was, just below. I crouched, heart hammering, and hovered a hand above the leaves. The air felt warm. Then a whisper seeped up through soil and roots, thin and broken. "You left me." My knees nearly gave out. It was Caleb's voice exactly, stretched and frayed, like it had traveled through too many mouths, too many years. I didn't think. I tore into the leaves with bare hands, dragging them aside in frantic handfuls. Dirt packed under my nails. Sweat prickled my forehead. My skull pounded with one certainty. Whatever I found, I couldn't walk away again. My fingers brushed something smooth. Paper. I yanked it free. A crayon drawing on cheap printer paper, fresh, unwrinkled, untouched by weather. Caleb's face stared back, but wrong. Eyes too large, smile too wide, stretching past comfort, head tilted at an angle no child held. And he looked older, not grown, just continued in the wrong direction. Underneath, in uneven lettering, "I'm closer now." When I left the forest, my hands shook so badly I shoved them into my pockets. I told myself it was adrenaline shock, a panic attack. What I didn't want to admit was simpler. The ground matched the terrain I'd lied about for 2 decades. It looked nothing like the softened version I'd given police. The gentle incline I'd insisted on until I believed it myself. Seeing the truth rendered in crayon felt like the world tilting beneath me. The walk back to school blurred. When I entered my classroom, everything looked normal. Chairs scraping, pages turning, kids talking. Normal, normal, normal. I almost convinced myself the morning had been a break in my mind. Then, a boy near the front, one who hadn't drawn anything, muttered to his friend, "You always slow me down." My chest tightened. That was my line. From that night, before I could process it, another student said, "I'm not your babysitter," in the middle of a chat about football practice. Then someone in the back dropped a pencil and muttered, "Just go." My stomach rolled. These were Caleb's words. They were mine. Phrases I'd buried so deep I'd convinced myself they'd dissolved. The story I'd built, the rehearsed version I lived inside, buckled. This wasn't about kids or dreams. Something was bleeding through cracks in my memory and dragging the truth with it. Then a girl who barely spoke raised her hand. She didn't wait to be called on. Her eyes weren't quite focused, as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. In her own voice, but too measured, too deliberate, she asked, "Do you remember pushing him?" My vision blurred at the edges. My knees threatened to fold. I gripped the desk to stay upright. She blinked afterward, confused, like she didn't know she'd spoken. That was when I understood. The problem wasn't the kids. It was me. Whatever lived in that forest wasn't haunting me. It was peeling me open, forcing me to stare at the memory I'd sealed shut 20 years ago. I couldn't keep pretending the past was something that happened to me. It was something I did, and something out there wanted me to stop lying. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I'd take the day off, call in sick, anything, but feed the madness chewing through my life. Morning came, and my body moved anyway, pulled by something deeper than decision. I parked at the edge of the woods, like a man guided by instinct. The trees felt tighter, as if they'd grown inward overnight. The moment I stepped off the grass, the forest swallowed sound. Only a faint hum remained, something waiting. I found the depression easily. In my memory, it had been child-sized. Today it was deeper, wider, shaped like the grief I'd carried for years. I crouched, expecting the whisper again. The ground stayed silent. Instead, a sound drifted from above, a voice threading through branches. Light, uncertain, trying to be a boy, trying to be Caleb, but it wasn't right. The pitch wavered, rhythm stuttered, emotion sliding into the wrong places. An imitation, stitched from scraps by something that understood the outline of a child, not the soul. I stared up into the interlocking limbs. Nothing moved, yet I felt eyes studying me, practicing me. The memory didn't return as one piece. It surfaced in fragments, each one wrestling against the version I'd repeated for years. I saw my younger self shove Caleb hard, frustrated, meant to end the argument, not his life. I clung to that excuse. I didn't mean it. I snapped. Brothers fight. Kids fall. It couldn't have been that bad. Then the next fragment broke the justification in half. Caleb stumbled over the embankment and hit the ground with more force than I'd allowed myself to remember hard enough to knock the breath from him in a sharp, startled gasp. His hand raked leaves, reaching for balance long after he'd stopped moving. A thought tried to surface, ancient and cowardly, the one I'd buried deepest. He'll get up. He always gets up. You don't have to deal with this. Just walk. Just breathe. Leave it. He would get up and follow me like he always did. And then I saw what I'd refused to admit for 20 years. I turned away because it was easier. Because anger had hollowed out everything but my desire to escape responsibility. Because I believed distance would make it less my fault. The memory didn't accuse me. It simply showed what happened. And that honesty hurt worse than any judgment. Something in me went numb. A dissociation I knew too well. The same emptiness I'd cultivated my entire adult life, so I wouldn't have to touch this. The forest answered it. Leaves rustled with purpose, not wind. Roots shifted under soil like muscles waking. The boundary between memory and place thinned until it felt ready to tear. A scrap of paper caught my eye, pinned to a tree with a sharpened twig. Another crayon drawing. Caleb lay curled in leaves, knees drawn up, exactly as I now remembered him after the fall. Behind him, half emerging from the ground, a long pale arm stretched out, cradling him, comforting him. I pressed my palm to the tree to steady myself. The bark felt warm. I started to cry, ugly, shaking sobs dragged out of me, as if they'd waited 2 decades for air. The trees seemed to echo the sound back, and when the last echo faded, I realized it wasn't only mirroring my sorrow. It was learning me, preparing. By the time I got home, the shaking hadn't stopped. Dirt streaked my clothes. I kept waiting for my usual defenses to return: numbness, denial, the emotional tools that had carried me for 20 years. But the truth was too loud now. I shut the door and leaned against it, breath scraping. My mind searched for an exit, trying to rebuild the same excuses. I don't have to go back into those woods. Nothing is making me. People live with secrets all the time. I already have. I can do it again. Out loud, the thoughts sounded cheap, thin paper against fire. I didn't believe them anymore. And the house, in its suffocating quiet, seemed to know it. I wandered room to room, rubbing my arms, chasing a chill that wasn't physical. The truth I carried weighed more than any drawing, whisper, or distorted voice. Then I stopped. 2 paths opened in front of me, both awful. One was the familiar one: avoidance. Pack a bag, get in the car, drive until the forest was a rumor in the rearview mirror. Seal the truth back inside and let time bury it again. The other felt like stepping into flame. Accountability. Go back, face what I'd done, accept whatever waited in the trees. My pulse hammered as I stood there balancing them, false safety, glittering on one side. Everything I'd spent 20 years running from burning on the other. Then the tapping began. Soft knocks on the back door. 3 light taps, a pause, then one more. A pattern I hadn't heard since I was a teenager. Caleb's pattern, the way he asked me to walk him to the bathroom at night. The way he wordlessly told me he was scared. The sound pinned me in place. I knew what waited outside couldn't truly be Caleb. I knew it was mimicry, an echo. But the message inside the rhythm was clear as speech. Choose. I slid down the wall until I hit the floor, shaking under the weight of it. I can't leave him again, I whispered, voice cracking. Saying it made it solid in a way nothing else had. I can't do that twice. I wiped my face with the heel of my hand and forced myself up. My legs felt unsteady, but determined, like some part of me had finally stopped resisting where my life had always been headed. I opened the back door. Night air met me like a held breath released. Nothing stood there, no shape, no beckoning hand. Only the forest in the distance, patient. I stepped outside and started toward it. At the tree line, pale moths drifted down from branches, spiraling into a faint, luminous path that wound deeper into the woods, marking the way. Entering the forest felt different this time, not like trespassing, like returning to a sentence I'd abandoned mid-word. Fear still hummed beneath my skin, tightening my throat, but it wasn't steering me anymore. Responsibility was heavier. For the first time in 20 years, I didn't try to put it down. The trees seemed to part as I moved, slow and deliberate. Tonight, the forest wasn't hiding anything. It was setting a path, an invitation. The embankment came into view, lit by a strange glow with no source. There was no moon, and still it stole my breath. Even blind, I would have known it. My body had remembered long before my mind dared to. There it was, the hollow. Earth shaped by a small body curled into itself, memory pressed into ground like a fossil. A voice drifted from the depression, soft and trembling. You remember me now. The cadence was almost perfect. Almost. I dropped to my knees before I realized I'd fallen. The confession tore out of me like something pried from between my ribs, every word scraping. I pushed you, I said. I was angry. I wanted space, freedom, a moment where I wasn't responsible for everything. My hand dug into soil, clenching it like a lifeline. I heard you cry out, and I left anyway. I walked away because I told myself you'd be fine, because it was easier than facing what I'd done. And I lied for years, to Mum, to the police, to everyone, to myself, most of all. The forest answered branches above easing, untwisting like shoulders relaxing after carrying weight too long. Roots shifted under my knees, settling. The air loosened. It had been waiting for this. Movement stirred in the hollow. Leaves peeled back and a small figure rose, slow and careful, child-sized. Fragile, my breath caught. The clothes were familiar, or trying to be. The hair, the chin's angle, the face, God, the face. Close enough to ache, familiar enough to lure, wrong enough that the distortions hid like tiny blades. Arms hung a little too long. Joints moved with liquid smoothness, bending in ways that made my skin crawl. The eyes held the glow not on the surface, but deep behind them, like lanterns behind frosted glass. But even with all of it, it looked like Caleb, and that was enough to undo me. Caleb, I whispered. The name trembled, coated in 20 years of guilt. The figure tilted its head. That tilt soft, curious, the motion I didn't know I'd held onto until it was recreated perfectly. I waited for you, it said. The voice was gentle, without accusation, like a child telling a plain fact. Tears blurred my vision. Something in me split open. For a fragile moment, I believed I'd done something right, that truth had earned me this. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe a chance to say goodbye the way I should have. I lifted my hand, shaking and offering a plea. Caleb reached out. Its skin was warm, human warm. Fingers closed around mine with careful pressure. And then it smiled. Caleb's smile, exact a memory made flesh. Relief flooded me, so sudden I almost sobbed again. Maybe I was forgiven. Maybe the forest dropped into silence. Not peace. Predatory silence. The hush that falls when something stops stalking because it's ready to strike. It didn't let go. The smile stayed, and widened a fraction too far. The trees stiffened. The light seemed to sink, drawn toward the thing's chest. "You remember me now," it murmured again. But the voice was slipping tones underneath, older, layered. "He cried for you," it whispered, leaning close enough that its breath touched my cheek. A tremor ran through its arm, like the memory excited it. I tasted everything he felt. His pain was delicious. My stomach lurched. Then, almost tenderly, it said, "But yours has aged into something exquisite." I yanked my hand free and stumbled back. It stepped forward, and with each movement, the disguise loosened. Its arms lengthened by inches, stretching like softened wax. Its joints hinged backward for a heartbeat before snapping forward again. Light brightened from within its pupils. Then a seam appeared down the center of its face, not a mouth, but a clean vertical split that opened with a wet sound. From inside slid something long and thin, almost elegant in its wrongness. A hollow proboscis, pulsing as it widened and narrowed, curling in the air as if tasting for what lay under my skin. Clicking sounds came from within it, insect-fast, hungry. I ran. Branches tore at me as I crashed through undergrowth. But the forest shifted with the creature, roots rising, limbs bending, steering it straight to me. It hit my back a second later, knocking the air from my lungs. Fingers clamped around my wrists, wrenching my arms behind me. Knees dug into my ribs, driving me into cold dirt. Its breath shook with triumph. "Let me drink everything he left inside you," it whispered into my neck. The proboscis stabbed into my forearm. White pain detonated, but the puncture wasn't the worst of it. Something started to pull. Not just blood, memories. The first wrench tore open the night Caleb fell, his cry reverberating through my skull. The next ripped at decades of guilt, thinning it into strands. Then it tugged at who I thought I was, unraveling my sense of self like fabric tearing. Grief drained out in hot waves. My identity blurred, my mind hollowed, my limbs weakened, slackening. Fingers twitched uselessly in the dirt. Above me, the creature shuddered, pleasure rolling through it, invisible pulses. So much more than the boy, it breathed. So much richer. Matured, blackness crept in at the edges of my vision. I couldn't tell if I was slipping into unconsciousness or simply being emptied. Then movement through the haze. Something small behind the creature. Small hands, small arms, wrapping around its torso and pulling. The creature shrieked, a layered sound too sharp to be human. It clawed at the ground, refusing to release my arm. The proboscis stretched painfully, still buried in my flesh. The small arms tightened and yanked. The proboscis tore free with a spray of red. Agony flared through my arm. I screamed and collapsed onto my side. Through blurred vision, I saw a child-sized silhouette holding the creature back as it thrashed toward me. Those arms, heartbreakingly small, held fast. I only saw the top of the child's head. Hair I recognized instantly. Hair I'd washed and brushed on school picture mornings. I never saw the face. I didn't need to. A small voice strained out, desperate and familiar. Go. I staggered upright, half blind, half conscious, blood soaking my sleeve, mind in tatters, and I ran. Branches whipped my face. My legs threatened to fold every few steps. Behind me, two voices rose, one monstrous, furious, shrieking my name, and beneath it a smaller voice, strained. Go. I did. And I didn't look back. I don't remember getting home. One moment, I was stumbling out of the tree line, lungs burning, blood pouring down my elbow. The next, I was collapsing through my back door, slamming onto the kitchen floor hard enough to rattle a chair. For a long time, I lay there, curled and shaking. My arm throbbed where it had pierced me, but the physical pain barely registered beside the emptiness spreading through my chest. A hollow so deep it felt literal, like wind could pass through me. Something was missing: memories, feelings, pieces of myself. I felt the gaps like missing teeth in my mind. I pushed myself up against a cabinet, gasping. My thoughts stuttered, skipping. I tried to grasp details, the creature's words, its face, the way it fed. But every attempt smeared into fog, like someone had reached in and plucked out the sharpest parts. One truth remained, anchored too deep to be stolen. Something had fed on Caleb, on his fear that night, on his grief as he waited alone in the dark. It had fed on the abandonment I made. That understanding crushed me more than any proboscis ever could. I pulled my knees to my chest, shaking. I'm sorry, I whispered, ragged, barely audible. Once it started, the apology kept spilling, quiet and broken, dragged up from somewhere rusted shut. I'm so sorry. I left you. I left you there. I didn't look back. I should have come back. I should have. My voice cracked. I pressed my forehead to my knees. The apology wasn't for the creature or the forest. It was for the boy I failed, the boy who cried out after the fall, and waited for a brother who never returned. For a long while, there was only pain and silence. Then a thought surfaced through the fog, unwanted but undeniable. Those arms. Small arms wrapping around the creature, holding it back with everything they had. Familiar hair falling over a childhood forehead. That silhouette straining, refusing to let it reach me again. If that was Caleb, or even a fragment of him, some last echo the thing hadn't consumed, then he did what I never did. He came back. He fought. He saved me. The realization split me open all over again, unbearable and blinding. My guilt didn't soften. It sharpened, clarified. But beneath it, something else stirred. A possibility I wasn't ready to name. Had Caleb forgiven me? I didn't know if those arms were truly his. I didn't know if forgiveness was even possible for a boy swallowed by whatever lived in those trees. But I knew this. I wasn't alone in that clearing. not entirely. I sat on the kitchen floor until my breathing steadied, listening to the refrigerator's hum and the slow drip of blood onto tile. The silence in the house felt different, less like a trap, more like a question waiting to be answered. Dusk shifted across the windows. I closed my eyes. That's when I heard it faint and far away from the forest beyond my backyard. A gentle tapping, soft, hesitant, unmistakably familiar. The same rhythm Caleb used when he was scared and wanted his big brother to come back. My breath caught. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it faded into the night, and I didn't know whether it meant forgiveness or goodbye.